Hello, everyone. Today's insider is Rabbi Yehuda Sarna. He's the chief rabbi of the United Arab Emirates. Great to have you this morning. Rabbi, what have the past few weeks been like for you and for the community in the UAE?
I mean, Michal, it's been like the opening of floodgates. And I would say that the thing that's been most energizing is the feeling that this is like a family reunion, that there's long lost cousins who are embracing each other for the first time. And I think that's the energy that most of the people who've, been in the various rooms that, we've seen in the media, whether it's the Israeli delegation coming to Abu Dhabi or other, potential collaborations that have been, that are in the process. It just feels like there's a match. There's cultural understanding, there's similar sensibility, and excitement for a very bright future. And so it's just like a family reunion.
You were appointed in 2019. You travel several times a year to the UAE. How did that appointment come about?
Well, I've actually been going to the UAE since 2009, 2010. I work at New York University. That's my full-time job. And New York University has campuses all over the world, mostly 6 of them in Europe. But then as NYU was looking out in the mid 2000s, they were trying to find a place or places in the Middle East to establish campuses. And one natural place to go, of course, was Israel, although in Israel, there is no other major research university that operates its own campus. Typically, major research universities in the States will partner with existing Israeli institutions. NYU is the first one to establish its own. And then it was looking somewhere else in the Arabic-speaking world. And of all the various Gulf countries, I think there was a meeting of the minds with the leadership in the UAE. And the decision was not just to do a study abroad site, but actually to create a 4-year college, like a world honors college based in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. And part of the understanding, and in fact, this is very much what the UAE wanted, was they knew that New York University had a strong Jewish representation. And I was invited by the president, John Sexton at the time, to come and help interview high school students who were coming in from around the world to interview to gain admission to NYU Abu Dhabi. And these are some of the finest students. Some have gone on to become Rhodes Scholars and win all kinds of awards. And that was the first time I came, January 2010. And my first time in an Arab country. And I did not know exactly what I was getting myself into, but I was blown away. That was my first encounter. I would come back once or twice a year in an NYU context. In 2015, I met up for the first time with a Jewish community that was becoming more organized, not in Abu Dhabi, but in Dubai. And they were having weekly Shabbat services and dinners. And I started advising them informally. 2017, they rented a villa, which was the first new synagogue established on the Arabian Peninsula in centuries. And I felt like there was something truly historic because my background was working with all different kinds of Jewish communities. I'm a very open person. Doesn't matter to me whether someone is secular, religious, Orthodox, conservative, reform. I want to support everybody. And with a small community like currently exists in the UAE, you have to have that embracing attitude. So they asked me to more formally kind of service the community starting in 2019, February of 2019, which I've begun to do. I'm doing it as a volunteer because I really believe in it. Did not know there was going to be this historic accord signed, which obviously casts everything in a very different light. I did not know it was going to be a public position, but about 2 months after I was appointed, unanimously by the community, I was invited. I had met the UAE ambassador to the United Nations, Lana Nusseibeh, and we met at an event hosted at NYU about tolerance. I was speaking on a panel. Lana was moderating. She came over to me afterwards. She says, "Anything the Jewish community in the UAE needs, just let me know. I'm going to help in any way that I can. And she spoke about her own family's tradition, the Nusayba family from Jerusalem, who had been the guardians for the past 800 years, 900 years of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a Muslim family responsible for making sure one of the most important holy sites in Christianity could be open. And Lana invited me the next month to speak at an event that the UAE mission at the UN was hosting. I got to tell you, Michal, this was and to this day remains one of the most truly exceptional moments of my life. I met her just that once. And she says, we're hosting an event. It's at the UN headquarters in New York. It is for the 50th anniversary of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. That's the group of the 57 Muslim or Muslim majority countries. And she said, it's the 50th anniversary lunch, and Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, is speaking, and the UAE wanted this event to be about religious tolerance. And so we're inviting the permanent representative from the Vatican, and if you would be so kind to come, that would mean a lot to us. So I walk into this event, a luncheon in a private room in the UN headquarters, because Guterres was there. It was the ambassador level of every mission that was present. 50 or so ambassadors from Muslim majority countries. And I had, my 5 minutes. And I took a deep breath before I opened my mouth, actually like in disbelief. Here I am as a rabbi, having the opportunity to talk. Now, this would have been extraordinary in and of itself, but this was also totally coincidentally, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, in our calendar. And I thought to myself, like, if there's ever a time and if there's a moment, it's this. So I actually talked about my wife's family, who in part was saved by an Arab doctor in Berlin, his name is Mohammed Helmi. He had befriended many Jewish families and Jewish patients, and he was a vocal opponent of the Nazis, and took it upon himself to hide this one family, try to get an Egyptian passport for my wife's relatives. She did not end up getting an Egyptian passport, but she survived by being hiding under Mohammed Helmi's, under his patronage. At times, she even dressed as a Muslim because he had kind of fake converted her in order to legitimate a marriage to his cousin in Egypt. So, that's the story that I shared, and the message was we all need to stand up for each other. And the conversation around the table that day in the UN was about combating radicalization. It was shortly after, a few months after the Pittsburgh shooting. A lot of talk about anti-Semitism, and it was really at that point that I began to realize that the broader significance of this kind of small but mighty Jewish community in the UAE.
When can we expect a full staff and a full-time rabbi in the UAE, and would you consider that post?
Everything is a possibility. You know that, Michal, from your own life. You never know exactly where things are going to take you. I think what's going to happen fairly rapidly is that the communal infrastructure in the UAE for the Jewish community is going to grow. I think the UAE is in some ways going to be like a Berlin to many Israelis, who are about 10 to 25,000 Israelis living in Berlin, looking for economic opportunity, but not too far from Israel. This checks many of those boxes, and I think it's also going to be like a Turkey prior to the flotilla. 500,000 Israeli tourists visiting every year. So I think that we're looking at a redrawing, to a certain extent, of the global Jewish map, of which the UAE is a very important part.
Now that Israel can be discussed openly, what would you say the most immediate impact has been on the community?
There's a euphoria among the community, because it has felt for a time in successive stages like there were elements of Jews' identity, which could become increasingly discussed publicly. So at a time, people were very hesitant to, even to say that they were Jewish, going back, 10, 15 years ago. There was a hesitation about that. And then there was hesitation in ever writing or saying the word Israel. And now it feels like for many people, of course, are connected to Israel in so many different ways: family, friends, business. It feels like they have an integrated identity now. And that was very powerful. Even as recently as 2019, which in the UAE was had a national theme of tolerance, religious tolerance. Even then, it very much felt like Judaism was accepted and could be very much seen as part of the mosaic, of the fabric of this Arab country. Israel, a bit more complicated, touchier, and so that wasn't really discussed. And now it just feels like the fullness of Jewish identity can come forward.
So would you say that within the past year, since your appointment, the sentiment has changed or shifted drastically even before the agreement?
I think the year of tolerance brought the Jewish community out of the shadows. It was prior, I wouldn't say it was secret, but it was a very private community. You would have seen nothing publicly online, no media articles, and out of respect to each other, no one would have done that. With the year of tolerance, and there's a very interesting turning point. There was the Ministry of Tolerance published a book called Celebrating Tolerance, where it had the kind of short histories of different religious minorities in the UAE. And the Jewish community was asked to present its own history, which was done through a series of vignettes and personal stories. And many of those vignettes actually centered around the question of how public to be. I remember the first time in 2015 when I addressed the Jewish community. I gave a class right before Hanukkah, and I talked about the different customs of where to place the Chanukiah, the menorah. At some point, originally, the menorah was placed outside a person's home. But in times of danger, when someone did not want to be publicly identified, you could bring the menorah inside and place it on the kitchen table. And when I presented that class, I felt like I was touching a raw nerve. Like that was the issue that people were dealing with. Even as the chapter for the Jewish community was being composed, in that chapter there are no pictures of anybody's face. So think 2018, no one was really willing to have their face identified as the face of the Jewish community. By the time it came to the printing, 2019, there actually was the face of a Jewish person on the front cover, alongside many other faces wearing a talit, who was willing to be publicly identified. So this sense of integration, it came fairly quickly. The UAE has always been a very hospitable place, and since 2010, I've never had difficulty coming into the country. Always wore my yarmulke, always wore my tzitzit. Never had any difficulty whatsoever. Always had my tefillin, my talit. But there's something about being publicly acknowledged, visible, which does make a difference. So when the Pope visited the UAE, Ross Creel, who's the president of the community, was invited to attend a smaller reception. So those kind of things do make a difference.
Rabbi, can you tell me about the congregation and the current religious services you hold?
Well, we're currently on Zoom, like so many others, Michal, and you would think that that would be to our detriment, which in some ways, of course it has. People miss each other. But in so many other ways, the past 6 months of weekly Zoom services has granted us, to a certain extent, what we wanted to have, what anybody would want to have during this truly historic time. I mean, historic because of the pandemic, historic because of the Accord, historic because of this is, in some ways, a Genesis story. It's a new level zero from which to build. And some of those first Zoom services were poorly organized, had 15, 20 people maybe, and where we shared like medical advice, public health guidance, and to the point where at the beginning of the summer they morphed into not just providing kind of spiritual meaning and Torah study, but also kind of the state of the union. How are we developing? Because there was an increased feeling that we needed a larger space, and we began exploring that. There was a feeling that greater sense of organization, a larger organizational foundation was being established, and so we began tracking, and also integration to global Jewry. We started having visitors of all different kinds, famous rabbis, local prominent Emirati personalities who came on, and it became, I mean, not quite like your show, Michal, but also a venue for people outside the UAE, Jews outside the UAE, to become part of the community to a certain extent. It became a platform for people who wanted to address the Jewish community to speak. And certainly once the accord was signed, I mean, every week has been just another production, and it's given the Jews of the UAE a great sense of pride that it's become, in a way, a platform for all this kind of for these kinds of encounters, which previously would have been unimaginable. I hope that things will line up such that they'll be able to be, some kind of movement on a larger space. I think the Emirate of Dubai needs a flagship Jewish space.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm telling you, we're getting inundated by requests of all different kinds, people visiting, etc. So we need a flagship Jewish space, and I'm very hopeful that we're moving in that direction. But there's so many things that have to get lined up.
Are you getting any backlash from Jewish communities or leaders in New York or throughout the United States?
I think the only reactions that I've got, which have been skeptical, I would say not negative, because who's going to say that peace is bad, right? The skepticism, there's been skepticism, I would say, from not all, but certain clusters in progressive spaces, politically progressive spaces. So though sometimes it's like a ho-hum, come on, everybody knows there were already business, etc. But between the two countries, there's already some degree of military cooperation. And some, especially in the far left, who are critical really of any government action. So, look at this as they would any kind of government kind of collaboration. So, but besides for that, I gotta say, wall-to-wall excitement. I mean, you see that in Israel for the most part. You see that in the United States. I mean, these are two countries where the polarized political partisanship and polarization has become so intense. And what this announcement is basically like a ray of sunshine through the corona clouds. And it's such a privilege to be an interpreter of those developments to many different Jewish groups who are just trying to, and publics, frankly, who are just trying to get a handle on what does this mean? What does this mean for the Middle East? What does this mean for Israeli society? What does this mean for American Jewry? What does this mean for global Jewry, for European Jewry? And it means many different things for different people, but virtually all of them good.
Are you expecting the Jewish community to grow in the UAE?
I think so. I think I would not be surprised if within a few years there's 10 to 15,000 more Jews living there, mostly Israelis. I look at Berlin as some kind of model, a city not too far away, a lot of economic opportunity, still very easy to visit back and forth, Jewish communal infrastructure that's building or is already somewhat there. And I also think about Turkey, what Turkey was before the flotilla, 500,000 Israeli tourists annually. Look, we're going to need to do a good job at building the foundations of the Jewish community in the UAE, one that is agile, that can accommodate kind of the balance between the residential community and those who are visiting, a certain kind of transiency between people coming in for a few years and then going, balanced with people who decide to make their lives there. And also the fact that it's in an Arab country, and it's important for people not to lose sight of that. In Arab lands, there's there's its own. Arab lands have their own negotiation between religion and state. Not exactly the same as Western countries, uh, and not all Western countries are the same. But that's been one of the things that we've been trying to navigate. Most of the community is Ashkenaz, is originally of Northern European descent. There are, of course, Sephardim, definitely a sizable population of Sephardim, particularly who've come through Switzerland or France, but some directly from Morocco, some directly from Tunisia. And with this, together, with this diversity, we've been trying to chart this course. But I would not understate the significance of the fact that a Jewish community has been growing organically, not as part or because of any political process, but just because Jews have naturally felt comfortable at home in the UAE for at least the past decade, and that, I think, is one of the things that gives many people, commentators, political people, others, the belief that this will actually be Israel's first warm peace with an Arab country. A Jewish community has grown organically, naturally, because Jews wanted to be there, and of course, the UAE has done everything that it can to make Jews feel welcome.
JNS published that Keren HaYesod and the Jewish Agency are launching some activities in collaboration with you, if I'm not mistaken. Can you share a little bit about what we're expecting in the coming year and what you see 5 years down the line?
Look, Michal, that's the meeting I just came out of. And I just came out of a great meeting with leaders of the Jewish Agency. And what I would say about our collaboration is that we're not just thinking short term. We're trying to work collaboratively so that we can develop a platform which one member of the community called a lighthouse community, among other faith communities in the UAE, that is a community that's not just insular into itself, but really one that can be, I think about the moment that I described to you at the UN, utilizing the fact that the UAE really is at a crossroads, is really open and a leader among Arab countries, to engage, to learn more about Arab society. Of course, there's Palestinian society in and through the state of Israel, but the Arab world is big, and to break down stereotypes, to dismantle any Arabophobia that exists within Israel, among American Jewry or beyond. This is an opportunity for exchange, and we need to build a communal platform which will allow for some of that lighthouse activity.
What can the Jewish community and leadership in America do to help strengthen the Jewish community in the Emirates?
Well, I've been working with a number of organizations based in the United States who have all pledged in different ways. Actually, it's been beautiful to see how everybody's filling a different lane, who've pledged a kind of support. And if the broad public is able to support their initiatives, I think that's essential. Jewish Federations of North America, which is the umbrella group of 146 or 147 federations across US and Canada, has pledged to help us philanthropically. And so there certainly is a financial need. AJC has announced that they're going to explore opening an office in Dubai or in the UAE, in either Dubai or Abu Dhabi. And they've played a really critical role in kind of soft diplomacy over the years, not per se in the accord that I don't know about, but I can tell you, just for the community's own development, they hosted one of the earliest convenings of Jews in the UAE, and the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, has said that they would help us track anti-Semitic, anti-American, anti-Emirati stereotypes or caricatures that are developing outside of the UAE, that is in the region, just so that we can be aware of what is developing. And we look forward to others. Those are three of the main ones. I think we'll see some announcements from a few more, but for the time being, those are the ones that we're focused on.
What obstacles are you foreseeing Israelis might face in the UAE?
They may not want to leave. I mean, it's a great country. They may not want to leave. So as long as, look, the what's deep in the DNA of the Emiratis is not just hospitality, but radical hospitality. You know, this embracing openness, and that I think Israelis, any tourist, frankly, experiences that. It's important for people to behave as a guest when they're guests. You know, to clean up after yourself, etc. Treat everybody with respect. And I think as long as tourists come in with respect, I think it'll be difficult for them to leave. They'll feel so embraced.
I can deal with that challenge. I'm really okay with that. What or where would you guide Emiratis who are looking to deepen their understanding of Judaisms? Are there any books or websites that you'd recommend?
We're actually considering doing a short series on the history of Jews in the UAE, because, like I mentioned, we've had all kinds of interesting archival material. Even though there is an older history. There was a 16th century, 16th or 17th century tombstone that was found in Ras Al Khaimah in Hebrew of an individual, probably part of a community which originated in the island of Hormuz, which is now Iranian. It had then had kind of a further outpost in the UAE. So, what is now the UAE. So there's a longer history. There's a shorter history. It's very interesting. The recent history is very interesting. So as we digest that, we analyze that. I think that might be of benefit. If anybody is interested, they should feel free to contact me. I'm sure they can reach me through you, Michal.
Absolutely. I'm sure a lot of people would be happy to meet you the next time you are in the UAE.
Well, I'm going to be there for Rosh Hashanah. I'm getting on a plane next week, I hope. So if anybody would like to meet up or get together, I'd be more than happy, Corona permitting, and schedule permitting, but I'd be happy to meet up with anybody who would like.
Fantastic. As a Jew, do you feel safer in New York or in the UAE?
I feel actually quite safe in both places. But I think it's impossible to ignore the incidents that have occurred in the United States and in the New York, New Jersey area over the past 2 years. It's impossible to ignore it. And look, those incidents are coming from different places, as it doesn't seem like they're part of any organized activities. So that makes me feel that makes me feel better. But there's no question that where there's an issue. My wife's cousin is a part of one of the families that lost someone in the Jersey City attack. So we felt that very personally. And of course, there are a lot of incidents in Brooklyn, some in Manhattan where I live. So it's definitely it doesn't go away. In the UAE, in terms of physical safety, except for my first time visiting when I was really confronting my own fears and my own Arabophobia, I've never felt unsafe.
Rabbi Sarna, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me this morning. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's I really give you a lot of credit for just convening these conversations. So important, Michal, and look forward to being in touch in the future.